What was the March on Washington by Kathleen Kroll. Chapter 1. Separate and Not Equal. Slavery ended for African Americans in 1865 after the Civil War. But being set free and being treated as equals to white people are not the same thing. In 1963, almost 100 years later, blacks still lived lives that were far from equal to whites' lives. Nearly 19 million African Americans lived in the United States, making up about 10 to 12% of the U.S. population. But states and cities had many ways of keeping the races apart, or segregating them. In the South, the rules separating blacks from whites were called Jim Crow laws. The name was popularized by a stage show in the 1800s in which a white performer in blackface makeup sang a song about a silly black man named Jim Crow. The Jim Crow laws said that blacks couldn't buy houses in certain neighborhoods. They had to live in less desirable areas. Their public bathrooms were separate, as were sections in theaters and drinking fountains. Some fountains labeled colored did not even have cool water. African Americans weren't allowed to try on clothes before buying them. Certain public swimming pools and amusement parks were off limits to them, as were certain restaurants and diners. Birmingham, Alabama even banned blacks and whites from playing card games together, as well as dice, dominoes, checkers, baseball, softball, football, basketball, or similar games. In the South, schools and colleges were segregated. So were hospitals, orphanages, funeral homes, cemeteries, and all forms of public transportation. On buses, blacks could only sit in the back and had to give up their seats if white people wanted them. Conditions were better for blacks in the North, but by custom and practice, the races were still mostly segregated there too. Special laws made it difficult for blacks to vote and elect people who would fight for their rights. For instance, in Alabama, black people had to take a reading test with tricky questions before they could sign up to vote. White people didn't have to do this. In 1963, it was still against the law in 21 states for a white and black couple to get married. In 1963, America seemed to be split into two different countries, separate and definitely not equal. The jobs open to blacks were usually low-paying: maid, janitor, dishwasher, driver, garbage collector, cotton picker, and tobacco field hand. On TV and in the movies, blacks were portrayed in these same roles. Professional sports teams were segregated too. Modern Major League Baseball teams were all white until Jackie Robinson joined the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1947. He had to promise the team owner he would take insults in silence and ignore hate mail and death threats. What could happen if a black person disobeyed the Jim Crow laws? In 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till was beaten to death because he may have whistled at a white woman. And then there was lynching. A lynching was a public hanging that could be imposed for any offense, even an imaginary one. The body would often be left dangling for others to see. Between 1882 and 1963, almost 3,500 blacks were lynched. Back on page 10 and 11, Thurgood Marshall, a landmark case, Brown versus Board of Education. A third grader was at the heart of a case that overturned segregation in public schools. Linda Brown of Topeka, Kansas, lived near an all-white school but had to take a bus to an all-black school that was much farther away and not as good. Her father and 12 other parents sued the Topeka Board of Education. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall, who later became the first black Supreme Court justice, argued for integrating the schools. And in a unanimous decision in 1954, the court ruled that segregation in public schools was illegal. Separate, by definition, could not be the same as equal. After this, separating the races came under attack in other areas of life in America. And civil rights leaders asked, could other branches of the government do even more to help? Page 14, the Ku Klux Klan. The KKK was a powerful, secretive terrorist group formed by 6 Confederate soldiers soon after the South lost the Civil War. Though they also hated Catholics, Jews, immigrants, and other groups, members were mainly white supremacists. They believed the white race to be superior to the black. They had secret handshakes and passwords, took odd titles like Grand Wizard, and wore white pointy hats and sheets to disguise their identities and frighten their victims. They enforced Jim Crow laws and terrorized blacks by setting crosses on fire on families' front lawns, burning houses, and bombing churches. They beat up people. They lynched people too. At its peak in the 1920s, the KKK had about 4 million members. In 2012, the Klan still had over 5,000 members, mostly in the South. Without any basic civil rights, it was almost impossible for blacks to fight back. This was normal life, and it didn't appear it would ever change. But by the 1950s, brave African Americans were starting to fight, not with their fists, but through actions that said they were fed up with being treated this way. This kind of protest is called nonviolent civil disobedience. The protesters were deliberately disobeying laws in ways that didn't use violence. For instance, groups of black college students would sit at white lunch counters in different southern cities. They knew they wouldn't be served, but they sat quietly and behaved politely. Most often, the sit-ins ended when police came and dragged them off to jail. It wasn't just young black people who protested. In 1955, a middle-aged seamstress named Rosa Parks was arrested in Montgomery, Alabama. She had refused to give up her seat on a public bus to a white person. Right after that, a young preacher, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., told the black people of Montgomery, Alabama to boycott public buses. They should stop riding them and find other ways to get around. The bus boycott lasted more than a year, and it worked. The Supreme Court finally outlawed segregated buses in 1956. For his part in the boycott, King now emerged as a strong national leader. The importance of churches. Churches were where many blacks gathered their courage to fight back. Since the 1800s, blacks had been breaking away from white churches and forming their own, such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church. At church, they strengthened their identities and learned how to organize, recruit, and raise funds for protests and bailing protesters out of jail. It was no accident that many civil rights leaders, such as Martin Luther King Jr., were preachers or ministers. The hottest spot in 1963 was Birmingham, Alabama. King wrote, "Birmingham is probably the most thoroughly segregated city in the United States." Sometimes it was called Bombingham. More than 50 bombs had been set off in black homes and churches in the previous 20 years. In May 1963, King and others organized a children's march in which children, some as young as 6 years old, hoped to speak to the mayor of Birmingham about ending segregation. That never happened. Instead, hundreds of students were arrested and jailed. Scenes of cruelty were broadcast on TV. While white adults threw bricks and bottles at the young marchers, the police turned on high-pressure water hoses, the kind used to put out fires. Kids were lifted clear into the air and slammed to the pavement or into buildings. Then the police brought out snarling attack dogs. Many kids thought they were about to die, and several had to be hospitalized. As nothing else had before, the TV images showed viewers all over the country what life was like for blacks in the South. One black minister named Fred Shuttlesworth said, "The whole world is watching Birmingham." 1963 was heating to a boil. Civil rights protests were taking place in many different areas, but not on a national level. It was time for many people to speak with one voice on a national stage in Washington, D.C.